Was it everything you expected? The music?
Yeah, it was genuinely brilliant.
So,
where's that from? Is that just like canned one that's on the thing or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, way to blow the professionalism of my podcast out of the water, but that is one of the canned ones. This software I'm using is pretty neat. They come with a few sort of like canned sound effects, and then I've uploaded a few little musical things myself. But I listened to that when I was doing the first episode and thought, you know what, that'll actually do. That's the vibe of this podcast. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, you're guest number one of the rebrand. So this is now called the Delve Deeper podcast, or just Delve Deeper. Because that's exactly what I want to do. I kind of want to get to know a bit about the people that I'm talking to, what makes them tick, and, you know, where they're experts in something, which I'm hoping you are. I want to know a little bit more about it. It used to be called the Will Berkman Variety Podcast, but my sister politely told me that I'm not famous enough to name it after myself, and then nobody would come on. and so here we are. We're taking it very seriously. We have music. We're called Delve Deeper, and I'm joined by my good friend Luke Tulloch. Luke is a personal trainer, but he's much more than a personal trainer to the people that know him. And so I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself, but then I actually want to explore, you know, the extra dimensions to you and how that kind of sits within what we maybe think about when we talk about the fitness space.
Yeah, cool. I thought when you said, but that's not how most people know him, that I should have like a drink ready for you to start telling me to skull or something. But
I mean, this is a drinking-friendly podcast if you want, but it's 9 a.m. where you
It is 9 a.m. It is 9 a.m. and it's still pretty dark, as we discussed off air. So I'm not sure just yet. I probably will have a beer this hour, though. So maybe that works. But
well, depending on how long the podcast is, that may or may not be on air. But
yeah, well, it depends how many times you have to retake for the music. But
go on. Tell us who you are, why you're here.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I'm a personal trainer. I mean, I'll give the brief synopsis of how I ended up where I am. I guess I was pretty interested in sport and training and that sort of stuff as I went through school. And then I left school and I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. So I just thought, well, I'll do a business degree. Didn't really like that. Accounting's not very fun. So I kind of thought, well, I'll become a personal trainer because I like training. And so I did that while I figured out what to do with the rest of my life. And how many years ago was that? 13 or 14 years ago. So here I am now. I've studied some other stuff like neuroscience at uni while I was working as a PT. And that just gave me a pretty good background in physiology and that sort of stuff, but I don't really use it too much. And I coach people 100% online now. So I'm living in Sweden and coach people online and do some educational stuff. And that's kind of where I'm at. So it's nothing too wild. It's just like a lot of time, I suppose, thinking about training and everything related to training.
Your life story kind of parallels mine in lots of ways, in that I also started PTing and started studying exercise science to give myself some time to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Because I think I had this perception that fitness wasn't necessarily a career. And certainly that it wasn't necessarily a career for somebody who's wired the way that I am and the way that I think that you are intellectually. And that's actually part of why I wanted to get you on, because I think you're somebody who's kind of bucked a lot of the trends within the fitness industry in ways that I think have been very rewarding. And probably just sort of sat a couple of years ahead of what I think has been a bit of a paradigm shift in fitness, which is towards treating it as more of a holistic, even though we don't like that word. It's a bit more of a holistic pursuit, you know, where we're sort of beginning to intellectualize fitness a little bit more and start thinking, what place does health and fitness more broadly, you know, occupy within our life, and how can we pursue it in a way that goes a little bit beyond the physical? So maybe we'll start a little bit there. As somebody who I think is a little bit of an intellectual, were you ever concerned going into fitness that perhaps people would think a little bit less of you than than you're capable of being.
Yeah, man. I think that was like a real big deal for me early on. I actually didn't like calling myself a personal trainer because I thought people would think like, oh yeah, average personal trainer, man. It's just like your classic sort of gym bro who doesn't really do too much and probably earns more cash than they should to tell people to pick things up and put them down again. So I was kind of a bit worried about that. And I think something that's always been a little bit of a sort of psychological quirk of mine is that I was always like really concerned about not like fulfilling my potential or things like that. Something I still struggle with a little bit as well. So for me, from an intellectual perspective, I did struggle a little bit with that. But at the other side of things, I really just loved fitness and I loved learning about how to get better at it. And for me, it was a good way of trying to apply maybe some more advanced concepts like, the physiology and the psychology into something a bit more tangible and something that I could actually use and something that I just enjoyed doing. So yeah, I definitely think there was a bit of an issue around like, oh, I should be doing something more here. I should be like trying to do medicine or something like that. But, ultimately it just wasn't really where my heart lay, I suppose. So it was a little bit of a conflict there with like the intellectualism versus like, well, actually, this is just what I enjoy doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I again hear so much of myself in you. I think there were sort of two big drivers for me to go and do my master's, which was in nutrition and dietetics. One of them was at the time I was probably unhealthily obsessed with my own nutrition. And that is a really, really bad trait if you want to help people clinically with nutrition, but that's the way that most dietitians are. But then the other thing was that I had this perception that exercise science would basically spit me out as an overqualified PT, and lo and behold. But I had this perception that was going to be the case, and that fitness was a bit of a career dead end. It'd be something very difficult to actually build something of worth in, but also that as a field, it is a little bit vacuous. And so I also didn't like the term personal trainer for a long time because I felt like it didn't quite capture what I saw as my own potential. But I've almost come full circle on that, where now I call myself a personal trainer, partly so I don't have to try and explain the things that I do that go beyond just saying pick things up and put things down, but also partly because I sort of aspire to a little bit more from the field. And I think in some ways, particularly because of the pandemic, people are starting to sort of see that a little bit more. The shift towards having to do things more online and have a service that is a little bit more encompassing and more maybe personal has made people realize that there is a little bit more to the field than they otherwise thought. But I very much felt the same way.
Yeah. I think the more I got into personal training, the more I kind of realized that it's actually an intersection of a lot of different skills and different disciplines. Even from an academic point of view, you could make an argument that, you need to know physiology and nutrition and biomechanics and psychology and even some business stuff, So it's actually quite an interesting sort of intersection between all these particular skills. And you'll find people within the industry that are almost like uniquely skilled at one or more of those areas, which to me is really interesting because you could say you're a personal trainer, but you might really be a fantastic marketer or, a fantastic, with your interpersonal skills or whatever. So I kind of identified that pretty early on. In fact, I was sort of over intellectualizing fitness, I suppose, in that I would love to spew tons of jargon at my clients and explain things to the nth degree when really they just kind of wanted an appointment to turn up to make sure that they did their training. Like that was pretty much it. And so I slowly started to realize like, actually, there's a lot more to this than maybe I gave it credit for to start with. And at the same time, I also started to see that, I still didn't really like being called a personal trainer and stuff, but I actually started to realize that there were a lot more people who were a little bit more maybe like us, where they were willing to go to university and do a degree in like exercise science or something, and then go into personal training, as opposed to, the person who's kind of just like, oh yeah, I like training and I'm actually maybe don't have the marks to get into uni or something. And so I'm just going to go and do a Cert 3 and 4 and then get into fitness. Still plenty of that around and nothing wrong with it. But I sort of saw, because I think I got into training people around 2007 or 8 or something like that. And around that time, maybe like sort of 2, 3, 4 years after I got in, I started to see a lot more people coming into the gyms I was working at with exercise science degrees or studying nutrition or something like that. So it's kind of been an interesting evolution of the industry, I suppose. And at the same time, me kind of realizing that actually there's a lot more to this job than meets the eye, which I'm assuming most people probably don't realize as well, but maybe are starting to clue onto a little bit.
Yeah, I'll say this many times this podcast. Again, I hear so much of myself in that story. When I began personal training, and I cringe thinking back to it, I would say to people sometimes, I'm here for information, not inspiration, because I presumed, if you've hired me, you must therefore be motivated, and getting you in the door is not the problem. The problem is you need to know exactly what to do. And that's just absolutely not the case. And so in some ways, I think my development as a person has been furthered so much through personal training, because it's sort of forced me to fill a bit of an empathy deficit in myself in the interests of professionalism, which is that's actually probably the worst way to fill an empathy deficit, to say, like, I don't really want to do this. I'm just doing it to be better at my job. But I did actually have to become a bit better of a listener and start listening to the subtext in what people were telling me, and, starting to appreciate what was actually motivating them and what was feasible rather than what was just optimal. And so again, I kind of came full circle, back towards some of the clinical skills that, say, I didn't actually really like learning in dietetics because I thought it was all naff, when I realized it's actually the stuff that works.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm the same, man. I actually realized at some point, like, I used to kind of go, well, there's two sort of categories of trainer that I observed at the gym I was working at, which was George Street Fitness First to start with. And there was one category that was like a little bit more on my side, which was a bit more academic and that sort of thing. And then there was another side of trainer who was basically everybody's best mate. And funnily enough, those were the people that ended up having the better businesses and the more enriching relationships with their clients. And so it really was a signal to me to be like, hey, dude, like, you might be sitting here on your high horse, but ultimately these trainers have a ton of clients that turn up to their sessions and really enjoy it, regardless of how quote unquote optimal it is. So it was a big lesson to me to, like, hey, your emotional intelligence here needs a lot of work, dude. You might think that you're like pretty smart, but maybe you're not so smart.
So I'm curious, was there a process that you followed to try and improve those skills, or was it something that sort of just came through osmosis?
Maybe a little bit of both. I would not say that it was something. Put it this way, it kind of went kicking and screaming, because I still thought I was right. Like, if you're doing this, then it's stupid and you're wrong. So I still very much had that attitude for probably the first 4 or 5 years of my career, to be honest. And it was just difficult for me you can't just like switch on social skills, I think, or emotional intelligence. It's something that you do have to work at. So I think it was partly of osmosis, just observing other people and getting comfortable with understanding my clients' needs and how to interact with different people from different walks of life and that kind of thing. And it was partly like me identifying, like, hey, this is actually a serious deficit in your ability to be a good trainer, and even, as a person wanting to develop a little bit more. And so that helped a ton to just kind of recognize that and to be very aware of my interactions, I suppose. And then it just developed from there. I don't think there was anything like, well, this is a specific skill that I have to work on necessarily. I think it was just a slow evolution. And once you have the self-awareness, it makes a really big difference.
So I actually began with palm cards. And so I'd walk into my sessions and go, like,
actually,
how are you? No, of course not.
Like writing down topics from the news to talk about or something.
Yeah. How about that weather? Nah, it wasn't that bad. But more seriously, what you said about identifying a deficit in yourself and sort of wanting to rectify it, that was very much the case with me, where I had to start asking myself questions, because, like, I'm sure I've been able to write half-decent training programs for the past 5 years. But here and there, I was having clients who weren't getting the results they otherwise could have, or weren't adhering to those programs in spite of, I would think, well-communicated reasoning. And so I did have to start asking myself questions that were quite uncomfortable, which was, instead of what's wrong with them, it's what's wrong with me or the service that I'm providing that's not bringing them along for the ride. But I suppose it's that same analytical trait that makes me look at my programs and say, what's the hole in this, that allowed me to do that to myself. And that process, I think, was very enriching, both in personal training and in life. And so it's something I'm very grateful for. I'm interested in something about this move away from perhaps over-intellectualizing fitness in you and in how you present yourself now, because I've noticed in your posts, say on Instagram, over the last couple of years, there's been a real shift. Initially, I'd have said you went pretty hard on the education side of things, and I think in a lot of ways your posts spoke to fellow professionals. You'd break down research, you'd have diagrams, and you'd explain concepts of physiology in ways that I thought were really well done, but were pitched quite high. And since then, I think you've really wound things back to very simple and actionable messages. Was that driven by the same thought process as what we're discussing now?
Yeah, pretty much. It was a very, very conscious decision, because ultimately I still enjoy the complexity of those topics. And I was posting about stuff that I really liked, but I had a switch, basically like we've been talking about, to try and think about what's someone else going to get out of this. And I realized that although I was kind of getting this, what would you call it? Almost like sort of false reinforcement when I posted some of that sort of stuff about mechanisms and physiology and that sort of thing. People would be like, oh, he's really smart. He really knows what he's talking about. And so you'd get a like or something like that, or you'd get a little bit of, maybe someone would invite you on a podcast to talk about mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy or something like that. But I kind of realized that, like, yeah, people were throwing a like at it, but they didn't really take on board what you said, and it didn't really like ring true for them somehow. Like there was nothing that they could really take away from it too much. So you kind of, I had this sort of, like I say, false sort of positive reinforcement of like, oh, I must be doing something right because I'm building a reputation as someone who knows what they're talking about. But ultimately, I didn't really think that what I was saying was having any meaningful impact. And I realized that even if I am pitching this to exercise professionals, like a lot of them are just either not really getting it because they don't follow my specific train of thought, or they really just want something that's like, okay, that's cool, man, but what do I actually do with my client? You know, so I did make that shift, and it's still something that I really enjoy and something that I actively kind of struggle with when I'm kind of over-explaining or over-intellectualizing something. I actively look at that and go, this turn of phrase or this terminology really sounds good to me, but I don't think that the person reading it might necessarily think the same way. So it was the same sort of process, and I suppose you can see that expression in the content I've generated and that sort of stuff. Just to try and simplify things, I found actually that the more I simplified, the more shares I would start to get on my social media, the more actual like comments and messages from people. And to me, I was like, okay, cool. Well, that's a better metric of engagement, because it means that people are sort of finding something in that content now that they actually find usable or something like that.
When I wrote my mentorship course for coaches, I definitely pitched a lot of the information very high. So I probably made that mistake. But one of the most satisfying things for me when I was writing each bit of content was when I was able to capture an idea that I thought was quite complex or deep in a way that was quite elegant, where I was able to distill things that I could speak about probably for an hour to just one slide or one graphic in a way that perhaps doesn't capture all of the detail, but captures enough of the essence that people would walk away understanding it. Do you feel that same way?
Yeah, there's something extremely satisfying with being able to do that. And, you know, it's difficult because there's a lot of nuance to a lot of topics, and I think we can be over-reductionist sometimes, which is frustrating because, look, ultimately the human body and physiology and training and nutrition can be extremely complex. There's just so many dynamic variables going on, and there's so many different situations and contexts that you could apply things to. And so sometimes I do think it's a little bit reductionist in fitness, and especially what you see on something like Instagram, where the format just doesn't allow you to really go into too much depth anyway. But with that said, I agree with you in that there's something really satisfying about being able to reduce things. And, you know, I've posted about this a little bit more recently, actually, that something that I try and have as a guiding principle in my life is a sort of subtractive mindset as opposed to an additive mindset. so to speak, which I'll explain a little bit. I think that we have this propensity to add more and add more and add more, and to find extra things to do to solve a problem or to make progress or something. And sometimes that is the way to go, but sometimes I think it's better to have a subtractive mindset, like what can I take away and what can I reduce and still get the same result? Or in fact, sometimes you even improve the message, or you improve something about your life by being a bit more subtractive in general. And I don't think that's intuitive. I think it's something that as humans we kind of actively have to work on, but I've found it to be super helpful, not only from coaching and content, but just in life in general.
So I know that you listen to the podcast People I Mostly Admire, because you put me onto it. And there was an episode in which whoever wrote the book Subtract, their names escaped me, came on and spoke a little bit about that concept and why it's not intuitive. But that episode really hit me when I was thinking a little bit about coaching as well, both in terms of the decisions that we make. Like, many people write programs that contain a lot of redundant exercises and things, but also in the place that fitness maybe has in a lot of people's lives, where people want largely similar things. They want to feel healthy, move well, be strong, look good, whatever it happens to be. But most ideally, they're going to do that in the most elegant way possible, because they want those things so that they can enrich the rest of their life, not so that they can invest all of their life to have it and have nothing left to enjoy. And so I think that subtractive thinking is like triply valuable in fitness, because it not only gets you to where you're going with less effort, it gets you to where you're going with more time to enjoy the things that you want from it, you know?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think that's tough sometimes as a coach, because when someone hires you as a coach and you end up taking things away from their training program and removing redundancy and that sort of stuff, it can be difficult for them to see the value in that. And they kind of go, well, I'm paying a lot of money here for this guy to write me a really simple program, or to tell me to get to bed on time or something like that, you know, and that can be a bit difficult. So I think there's this issue with a coach, where in a coaching relationship, where you have to somehow explain to someone that this subtractive thing is actually going to get them better results and allow them to focus on other areas of their life other than just training and eating. But it's difficult to make them see the value in that sometimes when they're laying down $400 a month or whatever it is. So it's something that I wrestle with a little bit as well, especially because I think that a lot of people might come to someone like you or I because they feel that maybe we'll be able to optimize by adding little things or having small secrets that other coaches haven't stumbled upon because they don't read as much literature or some crap like that. So it's a bit of a tough one, but I do think that, like, from a coaching perspective, it's a serious game changer, because, like you say, suddenly when someone can get similar results or enrich their lives in general by sort of doing less or having less to focus on, like, that's magic to me. Like I say to my clients, you know, if we can get you through to, like, working towards your goals for a period of time, making sort of the minimal changes necessary, then to me, that's a really good sign that what we're doing is right, instead of what some people expect. Oh, like every week I'm going to get these changes and something new added, or so just a lot of, I suppose, dynamic movement along that entire path to kind of get them towards their goals. To me, that's probably an indication that something's not right, because you're having to change stuff all the time, or you're having to add things all the time. So it's a little bit counterintuitive sometimes when someone's paying you and then you're kind of doing as little as possible, if that makes sense, but in a good way.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about personal training, or I presume any service-based job, where what you are providing is not really tangible. You know, like I send people programs, but there's no real way to hold up that program and weigh it, you know, on a scale against another program and say, well, this one's worth $400 a month and this one's worth $200. You can't do that. And it's the value that people feel, and in some ways the results that they get, but in other ways that's almost less important than just how good engaging with you makes them feel. And so in some part, I think the way in which I present myself online is something that I want to take more control of, because the people who come and work with you, you want them to sort of resonate with the ideas that you're giving to them, because then they're going to feel more value and do better and have a better time. And if you put out ideas that attract people to you who are neurotic and always want you to add things, then they're going to have a bad time when you do start this subtractive approach. But in other ways, it also, to me, justifies PTs trying to do too much, because if value is perceived, then seeing your program change on a week-by-week basis is a very easy way to sort of convey to somebody, hey, I gave some thought to this. Whereas saying, oh, that worked great, let's do exactly that again. It doesn't feel like you've put as much thought into it. But it's exactly like, do you know that that story? I guess it's probably more of a parable about the guy who has a piece of machinery that's broken, and he has all the young tradesmen come and try and fix it, and none of them can. And then the old guy walks in and gently taps one piece with a hammer, and it works again.
Yep.
And then he gives the bloke a bill for $10,000. And the guy objects and says, I can't pay $10,000 for that. You did 1 second of work. And he said, yeah, but I did, 80 years of study, and you're paying $10,000 for me knowing exactly where to hit. Well, that can be very much the case with training as well, but you have to convey that to somebody in a way that makes them feel that that's truly the case before they'll ever give you their money,
Oh, totally. And it's so tough sometimes, because I say to my clients, like, listen, the decision-making process that goes into whether we adjust something or whether we decide not to adjust something is fundamentally the same. I still go through the same process. I still use the same experience in education. And so a decision of no changes is sort of just as much quote unquote work or value as a decision of, let's change something. But again, that's difficult to see. Like, it's difficult to really feel if you're a client on the other end of that. So it's this weird balance of like making changes purely for the sake of buy-in and not making so many changes that you're kind of just doing it for the sake of. It's like a really difficult thing, because I'm always like aware of like things like the placebo effect, right? And just the value of buy-in and adherence and all that kind of stuff. It's like this real sort of murky ethical area, because you could, for example, make an exercise change and be like, so I'm making this change because it's going to hit the shortened position of your glutes a little bit more. And we've been spending a lot of time training the lengthened position and all of that. And ultimately, I don't think it really matters that much. But for them, they're going like, oh, hell yeah, that's awesome. And then they train a little bit harder, and then they feel like they're getting a bit more out of it. And then they actually do get better results. And so for me to say, well, I'm just changing it because I'm just changing it just for variety's sake, then they might not get as good results from that change in exercise or nutrition or whatever it is. And so it's like, from an ethical standpoint, do I have a duty to tell people that I'm purely doing this because of variety's sake? Or do I have a duty to kind of have a bit of a narrative behind it so that they get better results? It's a really tough thing for me sometimes.
It is difficult. And following that, this is one of the other things I find very difficult working in fitness. So you've mentioned in passing the complexity of human systems. And one of the things that I think annoys me the most looking around the fitness industry, because it's kind of intellectually dishonest, but I think it's intellectually dishonest without people realizing it, is just mistakes of attribution all the time. Coaches tend to attribute particularly desirable changes, but attribute changes that they see in their clients or improvements in their performance or whatever to the thing that is sort of most proximal to them, the thing that they were thinking about at the time, or the paradigm that they're thinking through, and so on, when oftentimes it could be attributable to something completely different, or, as is most often the case, a whole load of things, and only some of which you had some control over. And that annoys me because it just is, a little bit basic from a thinking perspective from other coaches, but it also can make me a bit of a nihilist when I go to think about what I do in coaching sometimes, because I go, well, like you said with the glutes example, like, does it even really matter? And it kind of has to matter, or else it doesn't,
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you think too hard about it, you end up feeling a little bit depressed, when in reality, like, you shouldn't be depressed. It's just a hip thrust. Like, it's a really, really weird space to find yourself in when you think too hard about it. I don't know. Like, you're nodding your head, so I know you feel the same.
Yeah, I mean, totally, man. It's Like, it's a real challenge. I kind of feel like with training and nutrition, it can kind of be as deep as you want it to be, as deep as you want to make it, and it can also be as sort of shallow and non-consequential as you want to make it as well. So it's a really interesting thing, and it also kind of gives there's this like weird intersection between n equals 1 and like try things for yourself, and like, well, actually, what's evidence-based and what can we say with some sort of confidence that is going to apply to most of the population. And the reality is like you say, because there's so much sort of converging in terms of variables, you could do something and be like, oh, hell yeah, this works really well, or I felt like it was great. And you don't really have any way of knowing if that was the factor that made any difference, or if in fact there was any difference. You know, sometimes, like, for example, growing muscle, it takes a long time. You can't always see the changes. You can't detect the changes, but it might feel like, oh yeah, my clothes are fitting different and all this sort of stuff. And so there's this like difficulty in, well, this is what we actually have some evidence for in controlled studies, and that's cool. But then we also have this limitation of controlled studies where it doesn't account for real life, which has a million different variables, and the individual in front of you. But the individual in front of them, you know, probably has a feeling about what works and what doesn't. That's probably not true, or probably doesn't matter. And so there's this super weird intersection between like clinically relevant and like controlling variables versus what's actually practical. It's just a tough thing to kind of muddle our way through, I suppose.
Yeah. And, you know, even when we do go into exercise science, there are some people who are like way off the deep end of just thinking all exercise science is crap. I don't think it's as bad as that. But there is plenty of it that's not great. But perhaps a larger issue is that the variability of responses between individuals to training broadly is often much larger than the variability of results for a given individual for two training protocols. And so it becomes harder and harder to necessarily look at, a study population and say, well, broadly, whatever it is, like dumbbell bench did better than barbell bench for growing pecs. We'll do dumbbell bench, even though there's maybe a good physiological rationale for that example. Doesn't matter. Point is, it's hard to look at a study result and say, okay, well, I'm just going to apply this broadly, sans context, because the studies don't even capture how much individuality there is in those responses. So it's just, like you said, it's a very, very weird place to find yourself in,
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was definitely part of the evolution of me, like the intellectual side of fitness. It's great. I was definitely very study oriented earlier on in my career, which is not a bad thing, but probably became a bit over reliant on that, and then kind of brought it a little bit more back towards the middle as it stands for those reasons, when I started to realize, like, oh, actually, there's a lot of variability in response, and there's a lot of stuff in here that, might have some measurement errors, or there might be type 2 errors here, because there's just not enough power in these studies in health and fitness in general, and that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's just something where you have to kind of go, cool, got to take a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B, and mix them up and see where we land. And ultimately, I think then is where I really realized, okay, cool, this is where being able to actually sort of relate to somebody and to provide them something that they enjoy, that's still going to move them towards their goals, and take that stuff into account, is really where the money is, so to speak.
Yeah. And again, this is an interesting thing that I observed in myself for a while too, is there's almost like a scientism aspect to the people who consider themselves evidence-based, where it's like, if there's a study on it, you go with the results. And if there's not a study, then we don't know anything. And in reality, I've already said why I take the study results with a grain of salt, but I really do think that there's a large part of our fitness journeys where if we sort of just followed some basic like deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning, I'm not really sure which one's which anymore, to be honest. I guess. But if we just sort of did some basic reasoning and were willing to test, retest, make adjustments, and integrate all of those, personal factors, what people prefer, what they have time for, what excites them, what's new, whatever it happens to be. Like, if we took all those factors into account, I feel like we would probably land in similar places. And it's just that, particularly for people who are concerned with demonstrating their intelligence publicly rather than demonstrating their intelligence by getting their clients places, they're very quick to sort of reach for the textbook or nothing, you know?
Yeah, certainly. Still a lot of that going on. And I think there's also been a bit of a pendulum swing the other way of kind of people being like, well, what do we even know? We don't, like, I don't know, you see a lot of these, I think it happens particularly in the movement space, like, well, actually, all movement is rotational or whatever it is. It's like,
man, don't start me.
It's not really that helpful, is it? Like, we're just broadly categorizing things when we say frontal plane. It doesn't mean that everything is like suddenly transverse plane and that's going to fundamentally change everything. It's just a conceptualization. But anyway, like stuff like that, it just ends up being like so reactionary that it's also useless. And so we have to be careful not to pendulum swing too far the other way. It's challenging. I guess it's just a big freaking mess, isn't it? Like,
it is. And again, one of the stranger things about the fitness space, and this is one of the reasons why I quite admire what you've been able to do, one of the strangest things is I think we leverage the fact that all of these swings of the pendulum and all these changes in terminology that ultimately don't really do much or change much, we leverage that to differentiate ourselves. If you can stand there and be the frontal plane guy versus the transverse plane guy or whatever it happens to be, that gives you an audience to speak to. And it is really important to niche yourself, to offer people something that speaks to them and that makes them want to go with you as opposed to the rest of the crowd, because there's so many people on Instagram. But to be able to stand there and sort of be intellectually honest in a way that is appealing is much, much harder. And so that's something that I very much admire about what you've done.
Yeah, thanks, man. Honestly, it's very, very difficult because if you say something controversial like that, you tend to get rewarded for it on social media because you get more interaction, you get more engagement, your stuff gets shown to more people, you end up with 100,000 people following you. Like, I actually did some business coaching, and one of the guys in there he was one of the coaches, and he's since moved on to another industry, but he said he'd built his Instagram to like 150K or something. And he said, you know what I did? I literally just went and found a really controversial topic. I took a side, like a hard stance on something, and posted it. And I got so much engagement, and that's how I built my following. It was literally like the keto debate. Don't be somewhere in the middle. Fucking take a stance. Either it's great or it's the worst thing that's ever happened. And that way, like, whereas for me, you'll notice how much of my language is like, maybe, could be, well, this is the pros and this is the cons. And it's just like, he's like, no, man, that's too wishy-washy. You're never going to get a following that way. It's like, yeah, cool. But at what cost? I don't know. It's like, I guess my point is you get rewarded by these algorithms and by the interactions you have, and fundamentally your bottom line as well. If you can take these extreme stances and have some kind of thing that you stand for, and I'm going to die on this hill, and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, if I had more authentic extreme opinions, then it'd be easier, but I just don't.
Yeah.
I'm racked by doubt, which is not great from a coaching perspective. No, the other thing, I thought of this, and it was kind of a trite thought, but it's actually true, is even just the format of an Instagram caption actually penalizes you for trying to give voice to both sides of an argument, because there's pretty strict limits on how many characters you can do. And often I write captions and end up going through and shortening words, so perhaps becomes maybe, because that saves me one, I think. But if you try and give voice to two sides of an argument, or you say possibly instead of just full stop, then you run out of space to actually say anything meaningful anyway. And it certainly doesn't fit well on one of those text style posts where you've got a little black square that sort of states your opinion on it. If you say possibly this or possibly that, like you've run out of space on the square. It's just very difficult to convey nuance on social media.
Yeah, no, that's a massive issue for me. And I just wanted to kind of add something there, in that we spoke a little bit earlier about trying to communicate to people in a way that they understand things. And I had a massive period of kind of being like, well, it's not, like, read between the lines a little bit. Sometimes you have to take some like intellectual responsibility. And when someone says something, you kind of have to be able to think about it yourself as opposed to having absolutely everything explicitly spelled out for you. And I still get really frustrated by that because you might write a caption and use every single last available character to you and put as much detail and in this situation and in that situation, but remember this and also this. And then you still get someone asking about some really specific situation. It's like, dude, I can't address everything for everybody anyway, but much less on a freaking Instagram post where the format just doesn't allow any nuance at all. Like, it's still something that's really frustrating to me. And so I wish people would sometimes take a little bit more intellectual responsibility. And I wish I could sometimes just write something and be like, yeah, they'll figure it out. They'll use their common sense. But unfortunately, I think people have also been kind of conditioned into, well, I can just ask this person anything and I'm going to get an answer because they're so desperate to market themselves and to be helpful and all this sort of thing online. So just, I agree. Like, you have to be aware that if you're using any kind of social media platform, not only as a coach, but as a user, that the format is severely going to shape the message.
Well, I mean, this is a whole different kettle of fish, but I feel like, in fact, I more than feel like I know that social media, and particularly Instagram, has shaped the way in which we think and interact with information in a way that is not for the better either, because it rewards immediacy in everything. So anything where you say, take some intellectual responsibility, take this idea, put it against all of your experiences and prior knowledge and, distill it down and see how it applies to you. That's not really going to happen. People want to see something and within 15 seconds say, all right, that hits home and that's now my opinion. And, not only does the algorithm reward that, but because we are so constantly interacting with that stuff, our brains, have come to think that way. And people are lazy even in how they ask you questions on Instagram, because if you put up the questions box on Instagram, oh man, thoughts has annoyed me for so long. But the questions box doesn't allow somebody to write out, hey, look, this is my specific situation. This is what I want to know. And if they DM you and ask you a really long DM question, sometimes you just go, man, that's a bit much. Like, chill out.
Yeah.
So people just write keto thoughts. And you go, well, if you can't even formulate a question that gets to the bottom of what you want to know, then how are you going to know what you want to know when you see it?
Yeah.
It's perhaps not the healthiest medium, but it's also the medium that allows us to interact with the most people and to show the most of ourselves. And so, here we are.
Yeah. I totally agree with that, man.
So I wanted to sort of go back to this idea of subtractive thinking, because years ago, when I was just starting to get to know you, you were living a sort of self-professed minimalist lifestyle. And I distinctly remember you telling me you were going to bed at like 6:30 or 7 at night. Like, it was absurdly early. It was toddler hours, but you were also waking up very early because you would walk to work. And I think you would walk to work and listen to a podcast or something. And then you would work and you'd go home and you'd spend the afternoon doing a little bit of study, doing a little bit of cooking, and sort of not interacting with that many people, not pursuing that many things. And so I wanted to know what motivated you to do that and what lessons did you take from it?
Yeah, I suppose I want to start with the idea of minimalism and I suppose what it means to me, because it's not about doing as little as possible, so to speak, or having as little as possible. I think it's about really being clear about what your priorities are and what you place value on. And I actually think the origin of this was me learning how to budget, to be honest, because you have this finite resource. It's very, so I use an app called You Need a Budget, which basically you put all of your money in that. You have a whole bunch of different categories and you've got to allocate your money to everything. It's kind of like a $0 budgeting method where every dollar has a job, so to speak, even if it's to be like, okay, this is my emergency fund that I'm not touching. And so doing that, you kind of realize like, holy shit, I spend a lot of money on X, Y, and Z, or is that really worth it? Because I'd rather allocate this money to something else. And broadly, I think I took that concept and went, well, hang on. Not only can I do this for money, but I can do this for my time and for my intellectual effort and literally anything else in life as well. And so that's kind of where it was born out of. And so it's not necessarily about not doing that much, which a lot of people think. It's more about like, what do I place value on, and how am I going to allocate my limited resources, whether that's money or time or effort. And so I guess I was kind of just exploring that a little bit and kind of thinking about what I wanted to spend my time doing. And it wasn't like hanging around at work between sessions. It wasn't, if I'm going to, like I did wake up early, but for me, it was enough time to sort of drink my coffee without having to rush it, because then I wouldn't enjoy it. You know what I mean? And so for me, it was like, well, actually, yes, I sacrifice a little bit of time in having to get up a bit earlier and having to go to bed a bit earlier, but it's more about maximizing the return in terms of enjoyment of what I can do in the morning and not having to rush through my morning. Being able to take the time to walk in those early hours where everything's quiet and nobody else is up. It's just like a magical time of day, So that's kind of what it was all about, I suppose. And I was kind of looking at what some other people were doing, like some other coaches where they'd kind of complain that they had such long work days and this kind of thing. And I was like, yeah, but you're still only doing like 4 or 5 sessions a day. You just happen to be at the gym for 9 hours, because you got all this dead time and you're not making any use of it. And so you get home and you're tired and you don't have time to spend on your hobbies or things you enjoy. And all of this, I don't know. I think what I was doing was looking around at other people in the industry and kind of being like, is this going to be it for the rest of my life? Like, am I going to be 55 years old on a gym floor trying to punch out 35 sessions a week so that I can pay my rent? Like, I don't know. It was part of that. And then it was part of just suddenly understanding like, wow, I can actually prioritize certain things and I can get a lot of utility out of prioritizing those things. And so I think I still sort of ascribe to that sort of lifestyle. And sometimes that does mean like, if I want to buy a new guitar, like it doesn't mean that I'm going for, the $400 guitar because I don't want to spend money on it or something. It's like, I still like nice things. I still go out for fine dining. I still sometimes, quote unquote, waste my time playing computer games or something like that. But for me, it's just about what sort of value am I getting back for what I'm spending here. And if I feel like that ratio is good, then I kind of go for it. I kind of forgot exactly what you asked, but I guess that's my little diatribe on it.
No, great diatribe. Thank you. No, it's interesting, the idea of mindful use of your time, because we've just come off talking about social media. And I feel like if ever there were and I'm very guilty of this, if ever there was a sort of time sink that gives you much less joy than the time it takes away, then social media can very much be it. And I feel like, again, in this day and age, because immediacy is all around us, we don't have to think about what are we giving up for what we're getting back. Even as a kid, for me, just to think about, am I going to go climb a tree or ride my bike today or something? Because either of them were investments of my time and effort. I had to actually do the one that I really felt like. Whereas now I think everything is just dropped in front of you and you sort of just do things mindlessly. So that idea of paring things back is very appealing. I'm interested though, because you sort of spoke about wanting to avoid being 55 and being on the gym floor and doing 35 sessions. I feel like though, a lot of people end up there through sort of living mindlessly. You kind of touched on that. But in the short term, I think the honey that lures a lot of people into being a PT is the idea of high disposable income and having free time and so on. Because you can be 20 years old and earning a few grand a week as a personal trainer. And if you do that and you get a car on finance and you live by the beach and you go out every weekend and you do cocaine, like, you're probably going to be having more fun than the average 20-year-old, for better or for worse. But you don't strike me as somebody to whom that was ever particularly appealing, and I'm curious why. Yeah, man.
Certainly seen a lot of that during my time, for sure. It's super common in the fitness industry, and I think a lot of people kind of get that out of the system, but a lot of people don't. I actually, like when I first started working, I was seeing guys in their 40s and 50s who were kind of still doing that. And so that was a definite, like, me going like, holy shit, that could be me in like 25 years. I don't really want to be there. What else can I do here? Yeah, I don't know. I think at the time I was just kind of like trying to figure out exactly what I wanted out of fitness and the fitness industry and that as a profession. Because I had this massive like drive to kind of better myself in some way. Like I said, like that sort of fear of not fulfilling your potential. And that's not just in the fitness world. That's like anything I do, really. I kind of feel I have this sort of sense of myself that I have enough sort of innate talent and intellect that if there's anything that I want to do, if I give it enough time and effort, I'll kind of be decent at it. Maybe I won't be brilliant, but I'll be pretty good. Maybe even above average. So I kind of had that sense, and I kind of didn't want to squander that, I suppose. I don't know. It was just something where I was kind of looking around and going like, yeah, and don't get me wrong, like I had my fair share of fun. Like I in my early 20s, I went on exchange to the University of Mississippi and like that was just wild. There was not a lot of studying being done. So I'll tell you that much. So there's still that aspect of like, yeah, I want to kind of have fun and like you got this money suddenly and you can blow it and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't know. There was something where I was just looking at it going like, this can't be it. Like, is this just going to be it for the rest of my life and the rest of my career? Is because fundamentally I was like in there as a 20-year-old kind of going, well, the dude that's 45 is fundamentally doing the exact same thing that I'm doing. There's not really a lot of difference between us, to be honest. And it's just like so scary to me to be like, fuck, like that's it. You've peaked. 20 years old and you're peaked. That's it. You're done. Like, so I think that was the main deterrent, to be honest. And I don't know. It just didn't have a whole lot of appeal to me anyway, for whatever reason. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. On the one hand, having that ability to project so far forward is a real gift because it does drive you towards self-betterment, you know, and you've obviously achieved a lot of things since you were going through that crisis. But on the other hand, this is something I've realized for myself recently is like being able to just be present is a gift. And I'm not saying like the best way to be present is to waste all your money on cocaine every Saturday, but I am saying that like being able to smell the roses and appreciate what is really good fun about your career is also important. And I don't know if you're at all like me, but it's something that I sometimes wrestle with is my ability to say, actually, I'm very content with today, even though I want to do better tomorrow. Do you feel that way?
Massively. It's actually a huge problem for me at the moment because, like to be perfectly transparent, my business is doing extremely well. And I actually don't have to work as much as I used to. I actually went through an active period of kind of being like, well, I'm working 7 days a week and maybe 60 to 70 hours a week. Is it possible for me to just do the same amount of work in less time? And so I actively pruned my hours. I actually halved them and said, if I can do everything that I need to do in a week in half the amount of time, I just want to see if that's possible. Turns out it is. It's incredible, actually. And so in terms of actual work hours, I don't work as much as most people do in a 9 to 5. And I earn a lot more than most people, to be perfectly blunt. And so there's this sort of battle in my head between, well, you've got more time and there is scope to expand this business and to fulfill more potential. Like I said, that's something that's probably like at the core, something that I wrestle with the most is like just trying to meet my potential and having that. It's almost like a fear of missing out. Like future me could be double this or something like that. So there's that, but then at the same time, I'm sitting here going like, hang on, I'm earning great money. I don't have to work as many hours as most people do. I don't have to go into an office and deal with like shitty coworkers. Don't rock the boat, dude. Like everything's fucking beautiful right now. So it's a real difficulty because I kind of recognize that. And at the same time, I do feel that for me to be satisfied and happy, it's to feel like I'm being productive and to feel like I'm making progress. That's like such a core thing for me. Like I don't, not to get too sort of metaphysical here, but like I do think that happiness is not so much a target or even an achievable, realistic thing. It's more just this sense of progression that gives me life satisfaction. So yeah, there's this massive wrestle between those two concepts, and so I feel that all the time, and it's probably like the biggest existential thing that I'm kind of having to deal with at the moment, and probably for the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think some part of it also must come from working for yourself and on your own, where when you work, and I very much feel this way. I look around at a lot of my friends who are intelligent, hardworking, high achievers who are working in finance or something, and they get promotions. And so you can sort of measure yourself walking up a ladder and you get a raise and so on. And so you get this sense of progression that is built into what you do. Whereas it's much harder to see that in your own career unless there is a tangible increase in the amount of money you're earning or the amount of people you're working with, or you offer a new product or something. And so I do certainly get the sense of stagnation in what I do sometimes as well. Even when things aren't stagnating, I'm better today than I was a month ago, and I'm doing more and have produced more and so on. I still very much feel that same way. So that's something I can totally resonate with, although, I'm 6 or 8 years behind you, I think, in personal training. I still very much understand. You go.
I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to also mention that this has its parallels to fitness, because, we've spoken about social media and also how, I've made some posts, and I actually sent an email out the other day about how this sort of curated content and what you get exposed to gives you unrealistic expectations, and you obviously get this sort of, comparison is the thief of joy kind of thing going on. And I actually realized that is something that happens quite a lot ourselves with business, because, funny enough, you obviously start to look at, your engagement metrics versus someone else's, things like that. And then I also see other people that have been in a similar position to me that I think are maybe not as skilled as I am, who have a ridiculous amount of income and these insane businesses. And it's difficult not to feel like, fuck, man, if they can do it, what's stopping me, sort of thing. And so even though I don't really care about that, I've got more disposable income than I need. It's a weird thing where you start to go, well, I could do more. Why not? So sorry to cut you off, but I just thought I wanted to throw that in there as well. I think it's just a function almost of what you expose yourself to and the circles that you run in as well.
Yeah, and if you're hard enough on yourself, you then say, it's a cop-out that I'm not doing better than them because I know I can. And then,
exactly.
Suddenly, I understand. Now, the final sort of fitness-related thing I wanted to ask you about is, you don't seem enormously motivated by the material. But in spite of that, you actually have achieved a really good physique. And I know you've posted recently about how you've given it less emphasis and you're a little bit smaller. But in most ways, you're still pretty jacked and probably the envy of a lot of people walking into the gym. And I'm interested if that development in your physique was just a manifestation of that desire for progress and experimentation, or whether it was driven by something else.
I think it was mostly the former. I think it was, for me, a way of expressing what I was learning and putting it into practice. And I have to be honest, once I'd achieved that, it was very difficult to take a step back from that. Once you've kind of set a standard for yourself, it's really psychologically hard to kind of do less, I suppose. And there was a long period where I'd kind of very lovingly expressed this knowledge that I was building and experimenting with things and seeing the progress. And it was extremely gratifying. And it kind of got to the point where I had from an objective point of view, an extreme degree of muscularity and that sort of stuff. And I kind of felt like I couldn't give it up. So even though I kind of got to a point where I almost lost my love of training quite a lot, I was literally going through the motions. It's still a little bit like that with weight training. I'm actually enjoying just going out and running and doing sprint sessions way more. But it's very difficult to kind of give up that progress that you've fought hard to win. And I think it was mostly just an expression of that. And I don't know if it was a case of also being rewarded for that on social media and stuff like that. I've still got tons of good pictures I can post of me being shredded at 95 kilos sort of thing. Whereas right now I'm 88 kilos and, maybe sort of not quite as lean even. So I don't know. It's just a funny thing. But I do think it was mostly an expression of, for me, it was an expression of my knowledge. And I felt like if other people could see my physique and be like, oh, he's really jacked. I could be like, yeah, well, how I got this way was because I had a thinking approach to my training. It wasn't a case of me just being a typical gym bro and kind of lucking into it, so to speak, which is kind of what happens quite a lot. Someone's good at sport or they just naturally are gifted and then they have a physique and then people go, oh, they must know what they're doing. Maybe not necessarily. I kind of felt like for me, I could say to people, yeah, my physique is a result of the work that I've put in on the study and being able to think about implementing it. And so then it was difficult to let that go and that sort of stuff. But I have to say, I'm enjoying my training a lot more now that I can actually move. So that's good.
Yeah, part of my lockdown training was doing a bit of sprinting, and I realized I run like a fridge these days. It's not good.
Yeah.
So in some ways, trying to rediscover my athleticism was very rewarding, and in other ways, it was pretty demoralizing to realize how hard I had to work. Yeah, this sort of occurred to me when you were talking about losing your love of training. When your interests are very singular and they do become all-encompassing, you work on fitness, you study fitness, and then your main hobby is to go in and train, you run the risk of kind of becoming a little bit burnt out on something that you used to love. And I think personal training is particularly susceptible to this because so many people start PTing more because they like exercise than because they even particularly want to help anybody. Have you found that branching out away from the training that perhaps your clients are doing or branching out into other hobbies has sort of helped you renew your joy of training?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I totally agree with your comment. It's people who tend to be like pretty sporty, but maybe not so great at other stuff that get into personal training, and then their friends are personal trainers, their life has lived in the gym, their hobby is training, they train clients all day. You end up getting very one-dimensional, even if you don't kind of burn out on it, which I think probably is inevitable that you will at some point. But even if you don't, you end up with like not much else to you, I suppose. And it's important for your own development. It's important to be able to relate to other people if you're a coach. So you should be having some experiences that are outside of the gym as well, because most people have experiences outside of the gym. And I definitely found that exploring some other stuff was very rewarding for me. It's another way of me being able to express that idea of like, well, if I put my mind to something, I feel like I can get decent at it. And I can sort of flex my need for sort of some intellectualism in other pursuits, whether that's making coffee, which is essentially chemistry, or cooking or playing guitar or something else. And I mean, I've posted about this before, but I definitely think that having a broad range of skills can help you get really good at the one thing that you choose to pursue the most. There's just carryover with ideas and ways of thinking and different skills that you can then apply to like the thing that you decide, okay, this is my main thing. And so, I think maybe in the past I would think that dabbling in something is kind of a waste of time because you're just spending energy on stuff that you're never going to really end up pursuing. But I've changed my mind on that. And I think that actually having a broad base allows you to have a higher peak. So, yeah.
So I love my morning coffee. I will sometimes be in bed before I've fallen asleep, kind of looking forward to that first coffee in the morning, particularly when it's cold. Yeah. Well, I imagine making your own coffee when you get it right is very satisfying, but I can imagine that when you get it wrong, it is just demoralizing. What's it been like for you?
It's endlessly annoying. And you end up like trying to fix it and you end up having like 6 coffees that day when you really intended on having 2 just because you want to fix the problem.
And at the end, you're like paranoid because you're so wired and you can't figure out.
Yeah. No, it just gets worse and worse. You enter the spiral of despair, and then you start it all again the next day, and maybe like you hit all the variables right, and it tastes great, and you're like, "Fuck yeah, I want another cup like that." And then you chase the dragon again.
So to be clear, are you like blending beans and stuff, or are you just using the machine and trying to figure out how to sort of do it as an art form?
Yeah. So I buy single origin beans from various roasters and stuff, and then each one will have the sort of different parameters that make it taste best or get the sort of flavor notes out of it or whatever it is. And so there's lots of different ways that you can brew, but I do a sort of pour over mostly, so like a pour over cone. But when you think about the variables, there's quite a lot going on. Like there's the water chemical composition even, and then there's the temperature of the water, how much you agitate it, the grind size, because that creates different surface area and a different flow rate through the beans, like all this different stuff that you have to kind of think about. So you can certainly intellectualize that as much as you want as well. But it is pretty satisfying when you kind of quote unquote dial in a bean and you suddenly go like, oh shit, like, the tasting notes on this have like, I don't know, like raspberry or something like that, and you suddenly go like, okay, cool, I get it now because I've managed to hit it. I've managed to get the grind size just right or whatever it is.
So I have a terrible palate for wine. I can tell you what I like and what I don't like, and I can describe in broad terms what I'm tasting, but I can't use the correct words for it. But I actually think that my palate for coffee is a lot better because I can pick out the flavor notes in coffee a little bit more easily. For you, have you found, one, that your palate is good across all things? Because I know you like craft beer, for instance. And two, did you sort of have to learn that skill?
It's definitely a learnable skill. It's something where you have to just taste a lot of stuff and you have to pay attention to what you're tasting and what you're smelling as well. So I think that my experience having gone through coffee, because I've done this sort of craft coffee thing and I've actually gone to like tastings, and which they call cuppings in coffee. I've done that sort of stuff for maybe 6 or 7 years, or maybe eight years or something like that. So I've had a fair bit of experience with that. And I found that going across to sort of things like craft beer or fine dining, it's definitely made a big difference because you start to learn to differentiate these things. And a lot of it is just, like I say, it's totally experiential. It's like when you're out shopping for fruits and veg or something, it's like, pick something up and smell it and like pay attention to the aroma and put it in your memory bank. Or when you're eating even a mundane meal, like kind of pay attention to the textures and the flavors and that sort of stuff. And if you can, like with wine or with coffee or chocolate I got into as well, or beer, if you can sort of have a couple of things side by side so you can taste the difference, I think that kind of accelerates your ability to identify things a lot. So it's a pretty fun thing, honestly. I think it like because like I have coffee every day, I have a beer probably like 4 days a week at least. I'll have a beer these days. We go out to restaurants every now and then. It's like something that my wife and I really enjoy. It just makes those experiences so much richer if you've developed that skill. So I actually think it's like quite a fun thing to do. Of course, it can get like super snobby, and probably some people have just listened to what I'm saying and they're rolling their eyes through the back of their head. But honestly, it's really enriched my experience of just stuff that I experience every single day. So it's pretty cool, I think.
I mean, if it's any consolation, I don't really have much of a listenership. So, it's only my mum. So it'll be fine. What you were talking about then, I think actually really sort of captures the ethos that I'm trying to go for in this podcast, which is that there's sort of so much interest and wonder in the world. Sometimes, right beneath your nose in this instance, and you sort of just have to look to appreciate it sometimes. And I personally find my life is enriched by being shown the things that I didn't even know were there. So, were my cooking not so bad, I would endeavor to do exactly what you said with my dinner straight after this. But given the way it is, I'm just going to sort of throw down a Coke Zero while I have it and wash it out as soon as I can. Luke, I've really appreciated you coming on. Can you just let everybody know where they can find you if they'd like to, and anything else that's in the works for you?
Yeah, man. Thanks a ton for having me. It's good to have some stimulating conversation. So my Instagram is @_Luke Tulloch, and my website's luketulloch.com. So feel free to connect with me there.
Cool. Thank you so much.